sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord which he spake by his servants, the prophets. Now, as you look at verse 2, what I want you to try to envision as well as you can with limited language given to us here in this verse is simply this. When the Lord sent these people against Judah, there was nothing peaceful about this. This is very much a violent endeavor. People not only died, but they were violated in the worst sort of ways as you can imagine. Verse 3, surely at the commandment of the Lord came this upon Judah to remove them out of his sight, for the sins of Manasseh according to all that he did. Also for the innocent blood that he shed, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the Lord would not pardon. Verse 4 gives us pause with regard to our country. But thinking about what these 4 verses, what I want you to give some attention to is the prophet Habakkuk. You don't have to turn there. Habakkuk was very much dismayed by what he was seeing going on around him. And Habakkuk, the prophet, had said to the Lord about why is it that there is so much evil and you seem to be doing nothing about that. And the Lord said to Habakkuk, oh, you need to think again. I am very much doing something about that. I have a people coming from a land that's going to come over and give attention to your land because you had refused to give attention to my word. Now, he wasn't speaking to Habakkuk and that Habakkuk had failed to give attention to the Lord's word, but he was speaking to Habakkuk, who in turn was to pass this along to Judah, who had failed to give attention to the Lord. And when Habakkuk had learned about this, he said, why are you bringing them over? They're nothing but a brutal people, and it's going to be decimating to us. And essentially the Lord said, you must sleep in the bed that you have made. Now, that's not the expression that you'll see in Habakkuk chapter 1, but that is the sense of it. And as you read here in 2 Kings chapter 24, you'll take note that that is essentially what we see unfolding here at the time in which Judah was then existing. Now, turn with me to Jeremiah 25. Jeremiah 25. Now, this is all preparatory to try to get an understanding of what we read in Daniel chapter 1. In Jeremiah chapter 25, it's a lengthy reading or a longer reading. You'll note this in verses 1 down through verse 7. Jeremiah was a prophet who was really current at the time in which you read in 2 Kings chapter 24 that which was going on. And it reads this way. The word that came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. That was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. That which Jeremiah the prophet spake unto all the people of Judah and to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, saying, from the 13th year of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, even to this day, this is the 23rd year that the word of the Lord hath come to me, and I have spoken to you, rising early and speaking, but you have not hearkened. Now, as you look at verse 20, or rather verse 3, what you'll take note there is that Jeremiah was saying, I've been doing this, trying to call your attention to that warning that the Lord had said for 23 years. And already by this time, you have refused to give any attention to what it is that I have been saying. Verse 4, and the Lord sent unto you all his servants, the prophets, rising early and sending them, but ye have not hearkened nor inclined your ear to hear. They said, turn ye again now, every one from his evil way, and from the evil of your doings, and dwell in the land that the Lord hath given you, and all your fathers forever and ever, and go not after other gods. Now, as you look at verse 6, when you turn from the Lord and go after other ideologies, which is the idea behind this term, other gods, then you have corrupted your way of thinking, and thus you will have corrupted your life. And go not after other gods to serve them and to worship them, and provoke me to anger with the works of your hands, and I will do you no hurt if you refuse to do those things. And if you think that I will do you no hurt, you need to think again. Yet ye have not hearkened unto me, saith the Lord, that ye might provoke me to anger with the works of your hand to your own hurt. All right, now so in 2 Kings 24 and in Jeremiah 25, we have the picture painted concerning why it is that Judah was taken into captivity. And as you see there on the map, you can try to get a sense roughly from the area of Judea. Go over there in that lower right-hand corner, and you can see the Mediterranean Sea, and they had to be carted from way to the left over there to the right, and you're looking at hundreds of miles. And they wouldn't be going straight across. They would be going up and over. And you're looking at hundreds of miles, and people would die on the journey. And that's saying nothing about those who died while in Jerusalem. This was a very devastating experience that Judah had experienced. Now turn with me back to Daniel chapter 1. In Daniel chapter 1, he and his 3 other friends were young men. And they were experiencing this. And you cannot even begin to imagine what was going through their mind at that time. They had no experience with anything that they were experiencing, not even an inkling of it. And whatever disruption there might have been in Jerusalem, it didn't correspond to what they were experiencing right now at this point in time in 2 Kings chapter 24. And even when we get to Daniel chapter 1, having already experienced it, young men, thus they were strong, and they were able to endure a great deal more than older folk were able to endure, and they were humiliated. They were humiliated. Note this with me in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, when you think about a besieging, what do you think occurs? Well, the army, the opposing army, will surround the environment that they are going to conquer. And they will allow no food, no water to go in, no help to go in. And so for a period of time, whatever length of period of time that was, the city suffered. And if they had any reserves within the city in time, it would simply be consumed. And then when they got to the point where everything that they had was consumed, then the army that was surrounding the city would be in proper position to strike at their own choosing. And sometimes that choosing was, well, not sometimes, all the times, at an inconvenience. Well, the people inside the city, they were struck in a hard sort of way, and they tried to escape that. And they were not going to escape. Anybody who tried to escape the city and go through the besieging army, they were going to die. They were going to die. And one man in particular, the king, he did try to escape, and Nebuchadnezzar caught him, and he made it a point to bring his 2 sons before his eyes, and then at that point, the king's eyes were taken out. Now you think about that experience. You think about that experience. The last image he had was his 2 sons standing in front of him. Now no image before him was going to be except his sons before him. Note this again in verse 2. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with a part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar. And you can see it right there, which would be essentially the area of Babylon, the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure of the house of his God. And so a violent experience that they had. How are they going to handle all of that? So you take note of the history, but then now you'll take note of the humiliation. And it's difficult to try to appreciate that, because there are so few words that are actually shared with us concerning what they actually experienced, but we do get some ideas. Note this with me starting in verse 3. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs. Now, as you think about that word eunuchs, think about the possible application of that word to the captives. Just possible. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seeds, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning and knowledge and understanding of science, and such as had the ability to stand, and them to stand in the king's palace. Now, as these people had been identified, what about those who had been considered and had rejected? What happened to them? Were they essentially put out, so to speak, in the salt mines? Was something else done to them? These ones might have been fortunate. But then as these ones, perhaps being fortunate to stand in front of the king and have an education given to them for 3 years, do you think that they were humiliated as they were experiencing all this? Because you are captives. And you are compelled to do that which I want you to do, and you have no choice in the matter. And if you try to think that you do, you will pay a price that you will not be happy to pay at all. Note this with me again in verse 5. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among them were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And unto them the princes of the eunuchs gave names, and he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah Shadrach, and to, or Shadrach's generally how we pronounce it, but if you look at the diacritical mark, it's Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. So these four men that we know very well from the book of Daniel, they were young men. They were young men who happened to be in a disoriented environment. Their education was corrupted by virtue of that which they had to now which they were going to have. They were humiliated because they were in essentially bonds, and even if they were granted some degree of liberty because of being in the king's palace, they were still in bonds in one way or another. These people were humiliated. They lost their parents. They lost their family. They lost all their belongings. They're in a new environment. They have a new educational system being jammed down their throat, and they had no choice in the matter. How was Daniel and his three other friends to respond to all that? We know about Daniel chapter 3. We know about Daniel chapter 1 and chapter 2. But when you think of these young men and being called upon to respond to this, how would they respond? And well, you know the answer to that. How would you respond in that kind of environment? Well, you'd like to think that you would be a Daniel, and that's good. But would you be? You know, how would you respond to all that? So you think about the history, you think about the humiliation, and you think about, as you take note, how Daniel responded, his heart's purpose. Now, the image that you're going to see here in just a moment is you're going to see men saying essentially to the king, I don't want any of that food. I don't think that's an accurate picture at all, but it does convey to you something along the lines of Daniel's purpose. He was not going to refuse to resist the king's offering to him if the king was going to insist upon it. Daniel, you'll take this or you will die. But Daniel was fortunate in that he was able to carry himself in such a way that there was somebody in his presence that had regard for Daniel, but not just for Daniel. Because how did Daniel carry himself? Well, he carried himself in a particular sort of way that was impressive. How old was Daniel? Probably just a teenager. And he might have been a middle teenager. And when you think of a teenager who seems to be a young man strong in character, strong in purpose, strong in integrity, that's a rare thing indeed. Especially when somebody is in the midst of an environment that is disruptive to their whole life. And Daniel was one of those rare individuals. But not only Daniel, his three friends as well. Note this with me in verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile. Note how that is presented in verse 8. Note how that is presented in verse 8. And the image up there that I have in mind is not that one you see, although that's a humiliation, as much as it is saying to the king, I don't want any of that food. You're just not going to do that. You're just not going to do that. No, Daniel made a request, and it was granted unto him. Because Daniel's presence was significantly important to those that interacted with him. Now, God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the princes of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and drink. For why should he see your face worse liking than the children of which you are of a sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head. So Daniel had regard, and there was regard for Daniel. Daniel made a request, and the request was heard, and the one who received the request said, but you're putting me in danger. What am I supposed to do when the king takes note of your countenance, your facial expression, and he sees that you're not as healthy looking as those that I'm giving all the delicatessens of the king to the servants? Daniel says, give us 10 days. Give us 10 days, and then compare us with those who eat the king's delicacies. And of course, that occurred. And when the prince of the eunuch saw what Daniel had experienced and his friends and how they were actually better looking than his associates, he decided that he was going to grant Daniel that request and give him nothing but the old American Standard Version says pulse, but some of your translations will say vegetables. It's not so much that he was a vegetarian as much as it is he did not want to corrupt himself if he could prevent from doing so, eating things that were going to be sacrificed to idols, for they were a very idolatrous nation. And so Daniel presented himself to Nebuchadnezzar's representative. The representative Nebuchadnezzar accepted it after a period of time. And so then Daniel was honored. And that's not going to be a slide that you're going to have on the screen, but note this with me in verse 18. Now at the end of the days, the king had said that he should bring them in. Then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all there was none found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king should inquire of them, he found them to be 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his whole realm. So you'll take note of the history, you'll take note of the humiliation, you'll take note of the heart's purpose, and you'll take note of the honor that was given to these 4 young men. These 4 young men. And as I think about those 4 young men in Daniel chapter 1, now I want to give attention to what kind of lessons can we learn from this? What kind of lessons can we learn? You're going to see 3 there on the screen here momentarily, and you see them right now. And I've got 5 more right here. That's going to take 16 hours. Now, as you think of these 3 lessons that we can learn from that, look at lesson number 1. If you have an anchor when there is corruption around you, how are you going to fare when that corruption around you flares? Well, you're going to stay the course. You're not going to allow yourself to be moved by that which is going on around you. You're not going to be like a piece of driftwood that Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 4, going to and fro. No, you're going to stay the course because you have depth. You have an anchor, and that anchor is keeping you steady when the tumultuous time around you is really rather difficult to experience. Well, you think about that in relationship to our day and time. Think about our own anchor. We live in a tumultuous time. Not that it's any more tumultuous than 1864 or 1860 or even 1939 or even 1969 or 1968. It may be, it may not be, but it's a tumultuous time. And when you think about these tumultuous times, how are you going to present yourself to those around you? You're going to have an anchor. And your anchor is going to be in the Lord or not in the Lord. There is no third option. And so when you think about that anchor, our anchor, according to Hebrews chapter 6, is to be in the Lord. Secondly, when catastrophe presents itself, it does not prevent one from being made stronger. Now think about that for a moment. Now you know this. I'm just going to remind you of it. When catastrophe presents itself, it does not prevent us from being made stronger. It's all in how we approach it. It's all in how we approach it. Daniel and his 3 friends, these 4 young men, had to determine how they were going to approach that catastrophe that was surrounding them. Well, they had an anchor. All 4 of them did. They had one another, and that was a support system. And when there was a degree of difficulty in front of them, that anchor gave them that purpose in their life to get through the difficulties. And so you'll take note of lesson number 2, the catastrophe that surrounds does not prevent one from being made stronger. They may not have understood how that was going to help, but when they looked behind them, they did understand then. Thirdly, you'll take note right there, when you properly carry yourself, others notice. Now, that again is something that we all are very much familiar with already. But people do notice. They notice how you carry yourself. They notice what you say. And as you express your thoughts, they're going to pay attention to that, certainly as you exhibit the life that you live. They notice. And as they notice, it will either be a compliment to what you say or it won't be. Or perhaps it will be confusion. Why are you telling me this, doing that? I'm confused about what it is that you actually subscribe to. Well, Daniel and his 3 friends, they, as you can see, they were properly carrying themselves. And you'll see that there in verses 19 and following. The king was impressed with these young men. And being impressed with them, he took note that they were 10 times. That is, they were elevated in ability above anyone else that had presented. But another lesson to be gleaned from this is simply our training. teach a child those things that he needs to learn, and then later on in life, he'll not depart from them. What do you think that means? That means that when you teach a child and help them understand those things in life that are valuable, they too will learn the value of them, and by virtue of learning the value of them, they will allow that to direct the remainder of their lives. But are you not teaching them the Lord's way? Is that something that is of value to them? It is. But what if they happen to turn away? It will be them having turned away, but it won't be you having failed to teach them. And if you teach them the Lord's way and they turn away, is that on you? It is not on you. It's simply they have chosen to no longer value it. But you've put it in their plate for them to digest, and they simply chose to go another route. Another lesson that we can learn, power of conviction. The power of conviction. When you have conviction, you can weather just about any storm that is presented to you. You'll be knocked on your backside, perhaps more than once, maybe a number of times. But you'll be able to get up because you have the power of conviction, and you have no alternative. Frankly, you don't want any alternative. But another lesson that we can learn will be the power of influence, which corresponds to number 3 right there. I simply wrote it a little bit differently in the margin of my Bible right here. The power of influence. What kind of influence do you have? Well, if you're the boss, you have a lot of influence. But how about as a friend? What kind of influence do you have? How about as a associate? What kind of influence do you have? Another lesson that we can learn, and that is the last one that I want to bring to your attention this morning, is simply the value of understanding. Now, turn with me to Proverbs chapter 1. Proverbs chapter 1, this is where we'll bring our lesson to a close. Proverbs chapter 1, the value of understanding. I may have said this before, I don't know if I have or not, but this is something that I do regularly. I read one chapter of Proverbs every day. Thus I read on 30 days, 30 chapters. 31 days, 31 chapters. And if there's 30 days, I read 2 chapters, 30 and 31 on that last day. Well, you read the Proverbs, what do you think you'll gain from this? It's simply immeasurable. You'll gain more than you realize. But note this with me in verse 5, or rather verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and understanding, or rather instruction. Now go back up here to verse 2. As you think about verse 7, look at verse 2. To know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding. You see, there's value in understanding. Understanding what? Understanding things that are greater than you. Understanding things that actually contribute to your anchor. Understanding things that contribute to your being able to weather the storm that is being presented to you, and it will be presented. Look at verse 20. Wisdom crieth out, she uttereth her voice in the streets. She crieth in the chief places of the concourse, in the opening of the gates in the city. She uttereth her word, saying, How long, ye simple ones, will ye love simplicity? And scorners delight in scorning, and fools hate knowledge. Turn ye at my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit unto you. I will make known my words unto you. And if you listen, you can see the value that's going to result consequently. But as you take note there in verse 24, if you don't listen, because I have called and ye have refused, I have stretched out my hand and no man hath regarded. Drop down to verse 28. Then they shall call upon me and I will not answer. They shall seek me early, but they shall not find me. You see, there's value in wisdom, but wisdom is only going to be of benefit if we understand it and we apply it, because that's our anchor. Daniel chapter 1 is a pretty powerful chapter, and I guess I don't have to say any more to you about that. You know it already. But when we think about the lessons that we can learn, there's some pretty important ones. And you can simply take note of those 3 right there, apart from the ones I mentioned. They're pretty important. They're pretty useful. And so, do you understand Daniel? Well, yes, you do. Do you want to emulate Daniel? Well, ideally, you will. Are you a Daniel?